In this video, I would like to illustrate you the Yamane technique with flanged haptic. This is a case with a completely dislocated 3-piece IOL and the pars plana vitrectomy performed. Now I lift it with a straight 25 gauge forceps, the IOL, grasping at near the optic haptic junction, and then with a handshake maneuver with a forceps I introduce through a side port incision. I give it to the forceps and externalize it temporarily to a side port incision. In this way the IOL is quite stable. Now I perform the Yamane technique. This is a 27 gauge cannula. This is introduced 2 millimeters behind the limbus through the conjunctiva. A small tunnel is created and then the cannula is passed through the sclera. In this moment I leave the cannula in its position and grasp again the haptic. Try to come about 2-3 millimeters behind the tip of the haptic and then introduce the haptic into the inner lumen of the cannula. Advancing the haptic a little bit more into the inner lumen and then slowly and very carefully following the track of the intrascleral tunnel, I externalize the cannula. This is the way how I pull out the haptic of the IOL, and the next step is to create a so-called flanged, a mushroom-like tip of the haptic. I grasp 0.5 millimeter behind the very tip of the haptic, and then with a cautery I heat up the haptic and create a mushroom-like tip, as you can see here in this video. This is to reduce the risk of slipping of the haptic into intraocularly. The haptic now is pushed into the sclera through the conjunctiva so that it is fully covered by tenon and conj, and then exactly 180 degrees from the original side I perform a second sclerotomy, again about 2 millimeters behind the limbus. The needle is left in the sclera. It is important to mention that the track of the needle should be counterclockwise, so it follows the shape of the haptic. Then again, handshake maneuver, grasping the IOL haptic very carefully not to bend it or to damage the haptic. And then again I grasp the needle and try to introduce the haptic into the needle lumen. Slowly the haptic is externalized, then pulled out of the needle, and finally again with the help of a cautery the haptic is flanged and a mushroom-like tip is created, again to ensure or to reduce the risk of slippage of the haptic. 0.5 millimeter behind the end of the haptic, then the cautery is used. There are two kinds of cautery. A low temperature, you have to go a little closer, but it creates usually a bigger mushroom. And then the high temperature cautery, you don't have to go that close, but it's not working very well in all kinds of haptics. Then the haptic is pushed back into the sclera. Make sure that it is completely covered by tenon and conjunctiva, and observe how nicely the IOL is fixed.